at UC Berkeley. His title is Assimilating HMI Data into MHD Models of the Upper Convection Zone into the Coronal System. So Bill, take it away.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. I remember, so coming from the modeling community, I remember seeing some of the first images and movies of HMI vector magnetic field data. And I remember thinking and talking with others in our group, like, wow, wouldn't it be great if there was some way that we could be a bit more like the meteorological community and be able to take this type of data and assimilate it directly into the active cells of an MHD calculation of the solar atmosphere. And of course, you know, thinking about those two things is a bit different, right? Because in the solar case, we have remote sensing data, of course, and we don't have in situ measurements of things at the photosphere. So after talking about it for quite a while, and we've been working on trying to, you know, couple different regions of the solar atmosphere, you kind of think you think about the challenges in two ways, basically. From the modeling point of view, first of all, the code, whatever model you're using has to encompass the region where the observations are from, ideally, if you're going to do an assimilation framework. And also the observations themselves have to be consistent with the physics of the model, and the physics of the model has to include all of the important heating and cooling, such that you have a model that is capable of incorporating the data in a physically reasonable way. So anyway, the first challenge, of course, is trying to get your code to encompass the regions where the observations are actually taken. And we've been working on this problem for, you know, quite a long time. And it boils down to the challenge of modeling regions in the solar interior and atmosphere that are very, very physically different. So there's, as you know, there's a huge change in density, and it's a huge stratification as you get closer to the visible surface. And then the corona heats up, the plasma beta changes from a high beta regime to a low beta regime. So you're faced with this daunting task of trying to get your code to encompass all of these disparate physical regimes. So we've had some success in being able to do that, but to get it at the scale that you need to have it to be able to investigate things like eruptive events and active region emergence and small scale turbulence interacting with magnetic flux and so forth. We had to really work pretty hard on being able to take a single fluid MHD model and extend it to the scales necessary to encompass the HMI regions and encompass interesting physics, and also be able to describe the radiative transfer in a way that was able to give us the convective turbulence and the surface conditions that were consistent with what you would see or would expect at the photosphere. So what we've been doing is your basic garden variety single fluid MHD, but with some special attention to the source terms, energetic source terms. And in particular for the photosphere, where the rubber really meets the road is the optically thick radiative transfer at the solar surface. So way back, so there are a lot of groups that do this problem really, really well, and have been for a long time, namely, you know, the Oslo group, for example. They solve the radiative transfer in detail and can calculate the intensities and emissivities and such to be able to compare very realistic calculations with observational data. That's just one example. There's other groups that do that as well, Bob Stein and Åke Nordland, and the Ames group, Alan Ray and Irina. But the challenge with that is that the calculations are actually very time consuming and they're non-local. So we wanted, so back in 2000, wow, way back in 2013, we wanted to figure out if there was a way that we could describe this optically thick transfer in a way that was physical enough that we could generate the convective turbulence in a way that was physically self-consistent and would again allow us to expand the range dramatically from, like a 50 megameter box to, hundreds of megameters and across a good region of the solar surface. So anyway, back in 2013, George Fisher and I derived an approximate treatment to the optically thick cooling that was helpful in this regard. Actually, and it was based on an idea that Dick Canfield was thinking about. Dick and George Fisher, way back in 1978, they were thinking about this escape probability formalism. And that is actually at the motivating basis of this approximation, although it's a bit more formalized. Anyway, so we implemented that some time ago. This is an example of something that was actually before that, using a more simplified radiative transfer treatment. But this basic spaghetti image here gives you an idea of some of the things that you can do with a ab initio code that actually encompasses parts of the convection zone, the surface layers, and out into the corona. This is just a unipolar, this is just a coronal hole quiet sun simulation that we did way back in 2010, I think. So anyway, this slide is just to illustrate the complications and the challenges of trying to model these different regions together. And you can just see these are gradients in temperature. These are the changes in pressure and energy as you go from below the surface to above the surface. And our whole idea here is to try to be able to model things like flux emergence at different scales in a way that's physically self-consistent within the framework of the models. So, so this is from the 2013 paper as a test of the radiative transfer. So what we were, these again are ab initio models. So basically the only thing that's being adjusted is a boundary condition, and that's basically it. The rest of it is just the physics of the model. So this is just a plot of the temperature in a box. This is a Cartesian simulation, and then just the magnetic field lines in a small subsection of that. So we thought, well, okay, so we got the turnover times pretty well, and the granular size looks pretty good. So we thought, well, now let's spread it out to larger boxes. And I always thought this was, I never called it a realistic simulation, of course, because the radiative transfer is super approximated, right? But back last year, I think, just pre-pandemic, this lower image here is actually one of the first images from DKIST. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised that there were, for being such an approximate treatment, it did a reasonable job in some of the qualitative features of what was observed. Obviously, we can't get bright points in the simulation. We're not doing the physics realistically enough. Anyway, when you look at, if you're interested in eruptions, of course, you have to go bigger than that, right? So a lot of, if you look at AI data and eruptive events, you'll notice that there are connections between active regions. There are interactions at many, many different scales. So to try to deal with that and make our box a little bit bigger, try to investigate those types of problems, we ended up rewriting things a little bit from 2013 all the way out to the present time. This is just a slide full of equations, but what we did was to make a new formulation that would allow us to be able to present these simulations in either curvilinear coordinates or Cartesian coordinates. And we updated also, some of our schemes to be able to knowing what we would have to do to be able to incorporate HMI data directly into the simulations. And so now the scales are getting a little bit bigger. Obviously, we're not at the same resolution as the surface granulation simulations, but we do have a range of capabilities that at least give us a fighting chance of being able to incorporate some of this really terrific vector magnetic field data. This is just an initial state of an atmosphere that we haven't actually run because we've been working in the Cartesian coordinate system for some of our data assimilation efforts. So this is just an initial state of a high resolution potential field source surface imported onto the Radium HD grid. Okay, so the second challenge is to figure out how to incorporate the data itself in a physically self-consistent way such that the model knows what to do with it and give results that aren't just crazy. And what I mean by that is if you look at, this is an image from paper Masha Kazachenko, George Fisher, Brian Welch, Yang Liu, and Zhudong did back in 2015 that shows the data. So I mean, this is just a slide that that shows you the changes in the horizontal magnetic field. In this case, from a pre-flare to a post-flare situation. So this is the stuff basically that we need to incorporate into the layers of our simulation at the levels of the photosphere. Now, to do this, you can't just plug magnetic field vectors into your code. You also have to tell it something. You have to tell it about the electric field or the flows in order that you're giving the code something that is consistent with Faraday's law or the MHD induction equation. So this is a slide from the same paper that shows differences in flows. So there's all this information, but you have to somehow come up with either a flow field or an electric field that's sensible, that can be incorporated in a physical way into your layers. So back in 2010, I think there was there's been a lot of groups that have figured out ways to invert the observational data to give you either a flow or an electric field that is both consistent with the observed evolution of the system and also consistent with Faraday's law. Our group actually decided to go with electric fields rather than flows for a number of reasons. But what we generally do to do this pre-processing is just so this is basically the Faraday's law right here. And then in this method called colloidal toroidal decomposition, what we do is we bust it up into a Helmholtz decomposition. In other words, the curls of a couple of scalar functions. And then you do a bunch of vector algebra. And when all the smoke clears, what you end up getting for these scalar functions, beta and J, are three coupled Poisson equations that can actually be pretty efficiently solved. And once you solve for those three, you solve for these two scalar functions, then you can back out the electric field, and then you've basically uncurled this equation and have an expression for the electric field that's consistent with your observations. The left-hand side of this is what you observe, and you can just plug it in. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes into this. I mean, we're using, there's assumptions that the magnetic field is divergence-free, that it's ideal. We're taking calibrated Doppler flows along inversion lines, and also information from local correlation tracking applied to magnetic elements. And all of that kind of boils down to an electric field that we hope is at least something that's consistent with what is observed and can be plugged into the models.
Well, you have about 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So these are tests. And so here's the bottom line of this, and I think this is supposed to be a movie. Oh, there we go. So this is the electric, so this is a magnetic field. These are the flows, the observations, and then from the PDFI method, these are the electric fields. So this has been calculated by the CGEM group, Zhudong and Masha and George and everyone else, and it's part of the pipeline. So you can get these electric fields, and this is just another example of that, another active region. And then you can put it into your scheme in such a way that you don't introduce numerical error. So anyway, we've been working pretty darn hard on this for a really long time with some success and then some challenges. So these are some examples of initial configurations of random MHD model initialized by one of Mark Chung's and Mark DeRosa's magnetofrictional models. And then this is a way of kind of showing the emission, kind of a proxy emission related to that. And this is active region 11158, basically incorporated. This is a different example of 11158, one of the initial stages from a simulation that we did using the new physics and the new assimilative techniques. So I think, you know, there's a lot of challenges here, but there's a lot of opportunity. And I know there's a lot of people doing this type of thing. And I think what once seemed like a almost impossible problem, I think we're starting to make some real progress on doing this in a really physically self-consistent way. So I'm excited to move forward. It's still a super underdetermined problem because of the, you know, even if you get the electric fields right and you're matching the induction equation or the Faraday's law correctly at the photosphere, you still don't really know what the thermodynamics is and the pressure and so forth. So you have to make some assumptions about the thermodynamic state. Anyway, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Bill. Very nice talk. Good summary. I think good introduction gives us a lot of good perspective. I don't see any questions yet, so let's see if one emerges shortly. Maybe you could just, in the meantime, tell observationally, you know, as an observer, what would be the next thing that you would really like to see in order to advance the state of the models, or are the models still trying to catch up with the observations?
Oh, I think the problem, Todd, is at least that I see. I think the observations are pretty good, and we're able to get a pretty decent, you know, estimate for an electric field. I think the real issue is, what do we do from a modeling point of view of figuring out what the magnetic pressure and so forth is at the photosphere and the temperature? So, I mean, you can imagine, right, that if you have a big concentration of flux and you have a nice initial state that's, you know, you think what it's observed to look like, but then you run a dynamic model, right, and you end up with all of these Lorentz forces that are if you don't, I mean, if you just, for example, have a constant pressure across the photosphere or something, you know, around a concentrated flux element on the real sun, what you would expect is that it's constrained by gas pressure, right? So we have to come up with a way of figuring out what the sun is doing in terms of the momentum equation, not necessarily the induction equation. And I think, you know, we're working on that, and we have some ideas of how to do that, but I'm not sure you can get that from an observation, right? I mean, maybe you can, I'm not sure.
So we have a question from Manolis, Georgolis again. This kind of undetermined problem, is there any way to constrain the solution with the coronal EUV or the X-ray observations that would be useful?
That's a good question. I think you can. I think what it can do is you can constrain the structure of the magnetic field in the corona some way, but I think the underdetermined part of everything, or what I'm talking about, is actually in the lower photospheric layers. I'm just worried about the thermodynamic state of the high density, high beta region. But sure, I mean, we haven't worked on that problem, actually. We haven't worked on using coronal data to try to constrain coronal physics. We've just been trying to essentially drive the photospheric layers in some sort of sensible way. I mean, you can run simulations and you can get output, but unless you really have a good physical approximation of what's going on at the photosphere in the models, I don't think the results are terribly meaningful if you have runaway Lorentz forces, for example. Did that answer your question, Manolis?
Let's assume so. One last one from KD, which is, I'm hearing that more constraints on some of the plasma states in the photosphere and the chromosphere region is what would be good to get from observations. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that would be great, actually.
Great. All right, well, thanks, Bill. If you could stop sharing
Sure.
your screen, then we'll move on to our final of the day, which is coming from